Hi guys, it's me again. Um, I want to do a shout out and then I want to talk a little bit about Freemasons in the Civil War. The shout out's to Marcus Moore. He's a new addition to the pipe smoking community online and has just put up about 3 videos, I think. He's well worth a look. And if you feel like a sub, we all know that there's nothing like getting followers or getting subbed to encourage you to post. Otherwise, you wonder whether anybody has seen your posts and whether you're doing well or not. I'll put his name in the bucket, the thing at the bottom again. I don't know whether to call it a waste basket, a bucket, or what, but his address will be down there. I used to be a Freemason. I say used to be because I retired. I'm still officially a Master Mason, but I've retired from my lodges. Not because I think there's anything wrong with them. It's just that I felt that I was lodge chaplain and I shouldn't really be a membership of the craft because of their belief in a supreme being, whatever that means to the individual involved. And I find that quite difficult. I still have, I still pray, but I don't know what if God's got hold of me, he's got hold of me. If not, well, he knows where he can find me. But anyway, Freemasons in the Civil War. You'd be surprised how many of them there were, especially amongst both sides, and not just the generals, but ordinary men, the ordinary soldier. And because they're on both sides, there was an extra comradeship between them. I mean, most of the soldiers knew each other anyway, or the generals did. They'd trained together. They'd fought together in the Indian Wars. They'd done all sorts of things together. The first two I want to mention are General Hancock, who was on the Union side, and General Olmstead, who was on the Confederate side. I'm a romantic at heart, and I suppose my heart's with the Southern gentleman. My head, to a certain extent, my heart is also with the Union side, so I'm a bit mixed up, but I hope I don't offend anybody. Olmstead and Hancock had been friends. They'd been fellow Freemasons. They were exceptionally good friends. Hancock was married, Olmstead wasn't. Olmstead was the type of man who his soldiers would follow him. He had that ability to inspire and lead, and he was part of Pickett's regiment. Poor Pickett. There is a story that when Gettysburg was over, General Robert E. Lee came up to him and said, "Sir, you should be looking after your men, the survivors." And General Pickett looked at him and said, "Sir, I have no survivors." He was absolutely devastated. All his men in his group had died. But Olmstead and Hancock, and along with a lot of other Masons, I think they'd been to a meeting. and afterwards had gone back to Hancock's house for a final party together. And the story is that at this party, they were splitting up to go their separate ways, some to the south, some to the north. And Low Olmstead was in tears as he hugged Hancock and said, "If I ever lay my hand upon you, fight against you, may it be the last thing I do." And they left. They went all through most of the Civil War, and they'd not met in battle, up until Gettysburg. The day before battle, Olmstead was talking to one of his generals, one of the generals that he worked with, whose name's gone. All names escape me. He said, "You know, I wonder how old Hancock's doing." And the general said, "Well, why don't you ask him? He's there on the top of that hill. Go over with a white flag, people have done it before, and meet with him." And Low thought about it and said, "No, I couldn't do that." On the day of the battle, they lined up. Some men had put their names and addresses on the back of their uniforms because they knew they were going to make that long journey and eventually come under fire of the worst kind. Olmstead led his troops. He got to the road and a fence, and his men were beginning to falter under fire. So he put his hat on the end of his sword and encouraged his men forward. They went up the hill, and they reached the wall, but were thrown back. Olmstead was mortally wounded, and he made a Masonic sign of distress, and a sergeant from the other side, from the Union side, came down and said, "Is there anything I can do, sir?" And he said, "Yes, could you tell General Hancock that I've been wounded and I'm here?" And he said, "I'm sorry, sir, Hancock's down." And Low said, "God, not both of us. Please, God, not both of us." He was taken to be dressed and that kind of thing, but he died. Before the battle, he'd given a parcel to his general and said, "Could you make sure that that's sent on to Hancock's wife?" And it contained his Masonic Bible. Hancock, during the battle, under the heaviest fire, climbed onto his horse and just rode backwards and forwards, encouraging the men to keep down, there's no place better than any other, and that kind of thing. And his subaltern came up and said, "For God's sake, sir, get off the horse." And he said, "Young man, there's a time when the life of a general means nothing at all." And I believe that at Gettysburg there's a sign, a monument to them, a handshake sign, commemorating their friendship. That's just one of many stories. Another one was at Fort Sumter. The man who held Fort Sumter had been an artillery trainer and advisor, and the man who was shelling him had been trained by him, and they were both members of the same lodge. And when the end came, they met and said how much they regretted what had happened and sent the prisoners on their way. There was a woman who was a Freemason. At least we think she was. What had happened is her brother, a young man of impetuous means, had been involved in robbing and raiding and murder, along with some other young men. And they were to stand trial and to be shot. And this woman came up after the trial, before the execution, and made a Masonic sign of distress again. And everybody thought, what do we do? So they stopped the execution and went forward, and she pleaded for her brother. And they didn't know quite what to do, because she knew all the signs, she knew all the things involved with Freemasonry. So they decided to leave it overnight, to lock the man in a barn securely and discuss what they were going to do. Somehow, during the night, the young man escaped through the unlocked door. Nobody knows who unlocked it, and nobody knows really what happened to them. But at least it solved the problem. One of the other stories was a man who was born in a Freemason's lodge, married in a Freemason's lodge, and died in a Freemason's lodge. His mother had sheltered in the lodge when there was part of the Indian Wars, and such was her distress that her son was born early. Later in life, he became a Freemason. He married his wife in the lodge because there wasn't another building that was suitable enough. And one night at a lodge meeting, he had a heart attack and died. Just an odd story. There were stories of lodge fittings being captured during battles, and a white flag being put up after the battle, and the fittings returned so that the men could carry on with their lodge meetings during their rest times and that kind of thing. There were stories of people being looked after by each other, never in the sense of betraying their role. It was always after the battle, or in Olmstead's case, during it. Lots of Freemasons. There was even an Indian chief who was a Freemason, and they'd captured some men and had tied them up and were being a bit rough with them, let's say. And one of those men managed to make a Masonic sign and was surprised when the chief came up to him and said, "My brother, is there anything I can do for you?" And he eventually let them go. I think that was Chief Tecumseh. So there's a lot of history and sort of links in there. And there are books that relate specifically to Freemasonry in the Civil War. And they're worth reading. I think I'll finish there because I've probably gone on too long. It's nearly 15 minutes. I want to tell you a story about this poor old guy. He was outside a pub and he was fishing in a puddle. And he kept pleading for a catch, kept saying I might get a barrel of whiskey and that kind of thing. And this guy came up and thought, oh, poor old fool. And he invited him in for a glass of whiskey, so he took him in the pub. And bought him a glass of whiskey. And the old man and he were drinking, and he thought he'd have a laugh at the old man's expense. And he said, well, how many have you caught then? And the old man looked at him and said, oh, you're the 8th.